You're listening to Neurodivergent Mates. Hello and welcome to another episode of Neurodivergent Mates. I'm your host, Will Wheeler, joined with my main man, Photon John. What's going on, brother?
Having one of those Mondays, battling executive dysfunction a little bit. Lots to do. Not a lot of energy to do it.
I know what you
How about
mean,
yourself?
man. I'm
Same?
stressed.
Yeah.
I'm very stressed, dealing with some workplace harassment and bullying. I'm not going to go into too much about it, but you know what? It's just not right. You know, I think this day and age, neurodivergent people should feel comfortable to be able to go into a workplace, whichever workplace, and know that they're going to be treated respectfully and in the way that everyone should be treated. This day and age, you know, bullying just doesn't, it's just not a thing, you know, and I think we need to do the best to reduce this and stop it. So I'm stressed, mate. So sorry to start the conversation.
I'm having one of those days too, but we plow through, right?
Yeah. Hey, I might just ask if you can turn your microphone just down a tad, brother.
I can do that.
Yeah, that's good, man. I think that's a lot better. But hey, you know what? We should really get into this today. We've got an awesome guest all the way from Melbourne, a good friend of mine, Myke Ireland, to talk to us about how being undiagnosed wreaked havoc on my teens and early 20s. Myke, how's it going, my friend?
Good, thanks, gents. Thanks so much for having me. This is a pleasure. I think I mentioned before, first time I've ever been a guest on someone's podcast. So
welcome. So just a little bit of, I suppose, insight into, I suppose, Myke's and I's relationship. When I was down in Melbourne, how long was that? About a month ago
about 4 weeks ago now, I think.
Yeah. I just reached out and said, look, everyone, I'm going to be down in Melbourne. Myke reached out. He's like, man, come on to my podcast. And I apologize. I can't remember the name of your podcast again.
Real Insight.
Real Insight. I knew Insight was there. I couldn't remember the first part. But, man, awesome setup. Like, your setup is killer. Like, proper microphones, everything. So it was such a great experience. And, I think any listeners here definitely check out the work that you're doing. But, we're just so stoked that you were able to come on today. But look, before we do get stuck into it, let's do a little bit of housekeeping just for all of our listeners out there. Now, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, like, and follow to all of our social media platforms. We're available on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, X, Twitch, YouTube, LinkedIn, and we're also available on anywhere you subscribe to your podcast. Also, too, if you haven't already done so, check out all the awesome work we're doing over at Neurodiversity Academy, and you can check that out at neurodiversityacademy.com. Also today, we may talk about some, maybe some distressing sort of things here. So some discussions may be triggering. If you need help, please reach out to a loved one or call emergency services. We are not doctors. This is a space for sharing experiences and strategies. Also, too, if you're listening on the live version, which we are currently in, please feel free to ask us any questions or interact with the show. We always love to hear from all of our listeners. Myke, thank you so much for coming on. We've been chatting forward and backwards since catching up in Melbourne. You spoke about you've just gotten a whole bunch of diagnosis, all of that type of stuff. And when you and I were talking, you spoke, you were speaking about a lot of stuff. And I think there was some that you weren't quite sure. I don't think you got a diagnosis for some of them at one point there. But look, I reckon, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. All right. So if we start with what I know now. And then we can go back and talk about how bad that was not knowing. But yeah, so when we caught up, when you came onto my show, it was well and truly known that I had ADHD. And that came from a bunch of just years and years of not knowing what was going on with my life. But then particularly in the last probably 3 or 4 years, I wouldn't say that I had what you would describe as a mental break. But I definitely went off the rails a little bit, to the point where you know that you aren't dealing very well with life, and it's not necessarily something that you're aware of why. Like I wasn't necessarily chronically depressed or have any sort of condition that was persisting, but there's just something not right. So anyway, we knew that we had ADHD. And then as part of the follow-up to that, I expressed my interest to try medication. But if you mention medication, the tests sort of go a little bit deeper, and there's some other stuff that they like to uncover because stimulant medication needs to be respected. And it's the sort of thing that you want to, make sure that you're fit for. So further tests then revealed that I'm also ASD. And out of those two diagnoses, ironically, the ADHD diagnosis was somewhat satisfying. The ASD diagnosis was the jackpot for me. That was what really hit home. Because I relate so much more to what I know about myself, exemplifying autistic traits that have really been the persistent part of my entire life. The ADHD stuff you can always see as an undertone, but I recognize, particularly with ASD, my struggles in early childhood and through my teen years, just making friendships and understanding the nature of what good friendships are and how to maintain them and how they should feel. So yeah, the picture's complete now, and I can title myself AUDHD. So
I'd like to say welcome to the club, but I don't actually come under the banner of ADHD. So welcome to Photon John's club, mate?
Hey,
it was actually flipped for me. So I knew for ages about the autism because my younger sister's autistic, and we kind of figured it out through her diagnosis. But the ADHD, I just didn't really know anything about because I was sort of focused on being autistic, and that was how I identified. And then when the person who diagnosed me finally said, actually, I think ADHD as well, I was like, I better read up on this. And I'm like, that's actually the dominant force in my life. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
Cool.
I find, the nature of these things with ADHD and ASD, it's like a hamster wheel. Where one thing is masking the other, but causing the issues of the other. And it's funny, the more I see this stuff unraveled in my mind, I'm like, is that actually just something that my ADHD is doing to mask this autistic trait so that I'm, not exposed? And it becomes this thing that unravels in your mind where you're like, well, which part is it? Like, what am I actually working on?
And you know what, right?
Sometimes
from
both.
Well, it's actually interesting knowing, say, yourself, Photon John, and now yourself, Myke, but other ADHDers as well. And you can almost, and maybe I'm wrong, when I've met, say, autistic people, and maybe they have different traits to other ADHDers, I can pick them up a lot easier through certain things, where for ADHD, and maybe I'm wrong, it's almost like the ADHD covers it. So it's hard to recognize. Am I right in saying that?
It's 100% right. That's exactly what I'm finding. And so then it makes it a challenge to try and work out what it is that I'm actually addressing today. And because I'm sort of going down the medicated path now as well, I'm 3 weeks into medication. Medication's dealing with some of it. It's actually taking care of some of the ADHD stuff, but then in turn, the ASD stuff really starts to scream through now because the ADHD is being dealt with. So now I'm finding a bunch more of the ASD stuff that's creeping up. And it's just a new thing for me to have to try and process.
Yeah, that would be a complete. And Photon John, I think you've said something similar in the past. How some people, especially once they got onto medication, for example, they actually didn't like it because it did change maybe a lot of the things that. And look, this isn't me saying, "Hey, get off medication" or anything like that.
No, this is a conversation.
Yeah, totally. Where it quieted in the brain where they wanted that. And even if we look at who is the bloke who used to be married to what's that famous rapper? He's really out there. What's his name?
You're not narrowed down a whole lot.
Oh man, what's his name? He's like, and his wife, who used to be his wife's. They've got this famous TV show, and there's 3 sisters, and the sister's father was
Kanye West.
Kanye West, yes. Great. Yeah, so we're there we go. That's how ADHD mind's gone into a full blank there, right? I think with Kanye West, we've heard that he he's bipolar and all of that he doesn't use his medication because apparently it distracts him from being able to be creative and stuff like that. So it doesn't work for him, or it probably works, but I mean, like, it doesn't work in regards to his music type of thing.
It's a balancing act.
I think it works for some
too. Sorry, John.
I was just going to say, I think it works for some, but not others.
Yeah, and I think it's a hard adjustment too, right? Like, you've been living this way for 30 odd something years. I got my diagnosis at 44. So 44 years of living this way, and then all of a sudden something changes, and so you're like, well, what now? Like, how do I know what baseline is? So I think and what I've stuck with during all of this process is the need to stick to talking therapies as well. So yes, there's medication. Medication's not going to fix everything, right? So as part of my treatment plan, I catch up fortnightly with a psychologist and we talk it through, because there's plenty of stuff that still needs to be talked about. And then I've got an ADHD coach as well that's just sort of teaching me the bits and pieces to make my day a bit easier on myself. So it's a full holistic treatment plan, right? And I think, that's one of the things that I think a lot of people get caught up in thinking that, once I get my diagnosis, if I get medicated, then I'll be fine and everything will be cool.
A lot more to it, yeah.
There's a lot more to it, man. And there's actually, again, there's a little bit of like, okay, it's great to move into the medication thing, but then there's also a bit of okay, well, this actually needs thought and exploration as well. It's not just flip the switch and we're all good. So yeah, it's a bit of a learning process there.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's just, and it was actually interesting. I went out for breakfast, or brunch, I should say, with my wife and one of the new advisory board members on for Neurodiversity Academy and his partner. And, she was talking about like how she's really getting into like other therapies as well. So, for example, I remember I went to this conference and I met this guy who does like surf therapy. And it's like, yes, you can be on medication, all that, but these other things can be really beneficial as well, if that makes sense.
You have to do everything you can to try and, I don't want to use the word normalize because, normal can be a tricky word in our environment, but to make your life more baseline for you. And that's the other thing that, I've got to get used to with this diagnosis, is because I've been through my entire life a chronic people pleaser, and I'm always chronically seeking external validation, because it's just.
Can I ask what you mean by people? Like, what would you do to be pleasing people? Like, would it be like, say, if someone wanted you to do something that, you didn't want to do, you'd just do it so you could please them? Is that what you mean by that?
sometimes they wouldn't even have to ask me, Will. You know, sometimes I'm driven by just thinking that if I'm not like this, if I don't have this persona about me, then I won't be liked. So then I go over and above for people, and then I've got to also try and find the balance between, well, part of that is just being a nice guy too. Like, you can also, you know, peel that back and go, it's okay just to be cool and be wanting to, you know, take care of all your mates and do cool things. But you always have to check, what is the driving validator behind that? Like, and my psychologist put me through a really great exercise a couple of weeks ago where you form a bit of a roadmap just based on your core values. So you've got to go through this exercise of deciphering the values that are important to you, the ones that aren't important to you. And then you try and build, like, you know, this pyramid of what are my core values. And so then checking in with those values consistently when you're making decisions that you would have normally done on that impulse, because I'm either thinking I need validation or I need to serve. If you're always just touching those values and going, okay, if I'm aligning with at least half a dozen of these values, it's the right decision. But if I'm not, and I'm still wanting to go ahead with it, well, then I'm being driven by something that isn't me.
Yeah, totally. No, interesting stuff. What we might do, we might just move forward because we do have a few questions that we, you know, and I think we're going through some really great stuff. But you know, tell us a little bit about, you know, the work you do, especially in the neurodiversity community. We've spoken about your podcast, all that. You know, what was the whole, I suppose, drive behind that and all of that?
Well, I've always been in technology, and it's one of those things where if you were to ask me what I want to do when I grow up, I still couldn't tell you. I've always been very unsure of the career that I wanted. So I tried to at least make sure that I, again, natively stuck to some values. I've always loved technology. I always loved music. And I'm like, so what industries align with that? And music production was the thing that I landed in. Which led through a few different career paths, and I ended up in commercial AV, so large-scale AV, stadiums, arenas, hospitals, universities, the like.
So would you do like big concerts and stuff like that?
We would more fit out a stadium. So like Marvel Stadium, for instance, like the PA at Marvel Stadium is something that we look after.
Wow. Oh, wow. That's crazy. What bands have you done then?
Oh, I don't do. I'm a complete back of house guy, man. I'm the guy that builds the systems. I don't do any staging or mixing or anything like that.
But it's for like big like concerts, right?
Corporate AV. Yeah. So more so if you went to like Star City. Yeah. If you're in Star City and you're in one of the big entertainment rooms or the big conference rooms, that's the sort of stuff that we fit out.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. So you spend a lot of time at conferences then?
Always like within the understanding of how AV is used in an environment. Yeah. So nice. Now I made it through various executive positions, heaven knows how at this point. But now I'm a director of technology at the firm that I work for. And I tell an interesting story about this because it's cool in how this came about. I talk about 4 years ago how my mental health 100% went off the rails. And I was working for an organization that was wasn't necessarily the best organization for me, I would say. Similar to sort of what we were talking about before, Will, where, you know, there's an understanding and then sometimes there's not an understanding. And, you know, I felt in that environment I probably wasn't understood the best. Coming to Insight, the place that I'm at now, the wholesale change in how this business was supportive of its people. Culture was first, you know, inclusivity mattered. All of those things all mattered. And for the first time ever, when I started to express that I may have been dealing with challenges, because I would never vocalize that in the work environment, but started vocalizing that, the amount of people that rallied around me to support me was not anything that I was ever familiar with. So inherently what that place gave me was an opportunity to actually be able to take stock in myself, step back from the grind that is, you know, you're a senior exec, and actually look after myself. And I think if I didn't make this move into this role, I probably would have never gone through the journey that I went through. We wouldn't be talking. So if they talk about the right things coming along at the right time, definitely I was fortunate enough for that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And, just hearing about that workplace, how supportive they are and, how has that made you, I suppose, how is that for every day in the workplace, out of curiosity?
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where I came into this place. I've worked for organizations previously that had amazing workplace culture. I worked for Alan's Music, and you'll remember Alan's Music
Yeah,
because
Alan's
you're
Music.
Yeah.
Yep. Worked there for a while. Another place where you work with people that are just passionate. They can't get enough of what they do. They love it. But in the sense of coming to this place, it's then inspired me to do a bit more around my neurodiversity because this is all new for me. Again, I've only known about this for a year, but I thought, well, I know how hard it was for me, and I know how much pain I went through, not knowing what was wrong with me, but also never feeling like I belonged or was supported. So it became a thing where I'm like, okay, this can cripple me, or it can give me another power to wield out in the world. And so my decision was that. And so I guess almost overnight, I turned a little bit spokesperson, just because there is not enough talk about this stuff. There is still not enough talk, and there's still not enough understanding. There's still not enough support, and people don't get it. Like, I started down this journey, and we can get into this a bit later, but I started down this journey because a friend of mine told me they were neurodivergent, and I turned really judgy on the word because I thought, is this just another one of those words that people come up with because they can't face their real problem? And then that sent me down this rabbit hole of uncovering what neurodivergence was, and then all of a sudden realizing that I had something that I needed to pursue myself. It's so weird.
Sorry, how long ago was that?
That was probably 2 years ago, because it was as my podcast was starting.
Yeah.
Because one of the guests that I wanted to get on is a female entrepreneur that I love and admire and have followed for years. She's a good personal friend of mine, but I said, okay, let's talk about, like, what are we going to talk about when you come on the podcast? And she's like, I'd love to talk about what it means to be neurodivergent and an entrepreneur. And I'm like, what is neurodivergent? And then, yeah. This is neurodivergent. This is
Yeah. Dude, sorry, I'm going to say something great. But when I came on your podcast, we didn't even have a conversation about what we were going to talk about, if I remember correctly. Because I remember rolling in thinking, oh, man, the dude hasn't sent me any questions or anything. And then you and I were just there talking. I'm like, he hasn't spoken about anything. Then we just sat down and rolled with it.
It's one gift that I've got, Will. The one gift that I've got is that of the gab. There's
you nailed it, man. You nailed it. And you know what? I think that's the best way to do it as well. But it can depend on your guest, I think, as well, because if you've got a guest who can just roll with it, then you've probably got other guests who are like, oh my God, I need to know the questions before I get there, type of thing.
I've had episodes that haven't gone to air because they went off the rails, just the way that it is.
Oh, really? Yeah. So ours obviously rolled well then, mate. Ours obviously rolled well. Hey, sorry.
We don't have that luxury. We don't have that luxury because we're live. Speaking of which, just to our audience, we're having slight technical difficulties. How am I sounding now, Will?
You're still a little bit loud and like really.
Okay.
Like.
Right,
Mike, what are you thinking of that?
Yeah, a bit boomy.
You need to turn it like right down, man. Turn it right down.
It's nearly off. It's the connection, not the mic. I'm just going to have to jump out and back in again. Sorry, cool, guys. I'll be back.
No problem, mate. Well, I'll hold the fort for you. All
cool.
Right. Okay, cool. So, we've spoken a little bit about when you're diagnosed, but what was that diagnosis journey like for you then? You're talking to someone on your podcast going, oh my God, I think this is me. What then happened for you then? Yeah.
So the natural inclination for me, I am a dramatic researcher, and research mode is another sort of ADHD, ASD thing that I uncovered. But if I need to know something about anything, I need to know everything. And so initially when I was looking at what does neurodivergent mean and what does that even cover, I would start to come across things that seemed familiar to me. And I think the symptom that I uncovered that really screamed to me like you are affected by this was the concept of rejection sensitivity. So rejection sensitivity dysphoria is probably one of my most defining symptoms in the sense of it has prevented me from being comfortable enough to move into a bunch of things in my life that I wanted to do, but always thought there's no way I'm going to be able to do this because if I fail, then people will think I'm a piece of shit and so on and so on. So RSD was that thing where I'm like, hang on a minute, is this just not how everyone feels? And then that led to another, and all of a sudden you're reading like it almost feels like your autobiography. And so went and saw the GP. GP did what he had to do and then made some referrals. And, I guess I was fortunate enough that I always had connections with people that had either received diagnoses or that were in psychology. I've got a lot of friends that are sort of in, either clinical or research. And it's probably safe to say that, I was peer reviewed ADHD a few times by people around me that could see that they're the sorts of symptoms that I had. It just took the formal approach to get it worked out. And here we are.
Yeah, there you go. Now, it's definitely interesting. And I think for myself that I found was how normal life, my normal life used to be before diagnosis, how I started to realize that a lot of the things that I'd normally do in the past, that was what was affecting me, if that makes sense. So, busy shopping center or going to a music festival or whatever that was, or even going to the pub. I remember when I was younger going to a pub and being so overwhelmed by everyone there that I just had to start drinking as much as I could to get drunk so I could just kill that pain. But then I just keep on going. I didn't know how to stop. And it was a real big problem, But with that being said, what are you now realizing about how being undiagnosed impacted you in your teens?
Man, my teens were punishing. I was a very insecure kid. My family life wasn't necessarily typical. My parents separated quite early, and I moved from location to location quite a lot as a kid, which was extremely terrifying. When you don't necessarily have a big family or a big community around you, you always feel like you're facing that alone. But I could tell now, looking back at ADHD and its influence on those actions, every time I had the opportunity to move, either start a new school or move into a new class at school, because I was so disruptive, I got moved around quite a lot. It always presented as an opportunity for me to reinvent myself. So what I would do would be look back on the last appointment, the last school or whatever I was at, all the things that people liked about me or didn't like about me, the stuff that I said that, got good feedback and the stuff that and I would refine my character to a point where if I go into this next school, I'm going to be the person that they actually want this time. And I would drive myself crazy, man, trying to please everyone, to
people pleasing once again. Yeah.
Yep. And then, you also have that other thing that's going on whilst you're undiagnosed at school, which is, you're always in trouble. You're consistently distracting. You are class clown. You won't settle down. We spoke about this on my show. You get tarred with this brush that is, you're just like an uproar. But then you're also put in this environment where I can do really well at what you tell me to do. I'll do it that well that I'll do it in 15 minutes. But the trade-off is you're then going to make me sit in this room for 50 minutes with my mouth closed, and that just doesn't work for me.
Yeah. It's like pain. I think we even said this on your podcast. It's like pain.
It's torture, man.
It's just
and so
torture.
Then you want to then continue to seek that attention and that validity. And so, I was always the kid that got attention by doing negative stuff. And it wasn't until I had one teacher, the one woman, Jeannie Young was her name, and God bless her. She's passed away now, but she was that teacher where every other teacher just wanted me gone, or, they just couldn't be bothered with the problem anymore. She was the woman that decided to sit down and say, mate, there's something that you're really good at, and it's not just being bad. And she could see through it. And she was the one that sort of put me on the path and I credit her with my ability to speak publicly. She made a bet with me in year 11 where she said, if you can pull your head in and do well, and I don't mean you need to get A's or anything like that. I just don't want to see you doing the same stuff that you do every year in year 12. She goes, I will put you on stage as the valedictorian. And I'm like, I couldn't think of anything better at that age than being the focal point of our graduation. So I did it, and I got the gig. And I credit her for that because, again, she was that one woman who decided to just look a little bit deeper and go, kid's got skill, just doesn't know how to use it. And
it's a good, look, I had teachers who were the exact same. They would definitely, don't get me wrong, if I was doing bad stuff, they would definitely tell me off for it. But it was like they knew how to build. I knew they respected me and I respected them back. So if I did do something wrong, I'd be like, come on, Will. And you're like, yeah, man, I can't not do this because this is the person who's doing really well for me. And a lot of the time when I had those teachers, I really thrived. And it was actually interesting. So when I was down in Melbourne for Edutech, I did the speech at Edutech, all of that, and got off stage. And there's this lady yells out to me while I'm walking through the convention center there, and she's like, "Will, you're awesome." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you so much," And I went over and started talking to her. And this was this woman obviously worked in a school, and she was with another woman. And I could just see that this woman was just so, such a lovely person and such a good. But then the woman next to her had like this angry look on her face. Like if what I was thinking was she was thinking I was full of shit because of what I was shit. I'm like, when I had this and that, and you could just see she was probably one of those teachers that I would never have gotten along with, if that makes sense, So they're still out there.
Yeah, there's heaps of them out there. Yeah. And so, that's what really inspired me, I think, to make the switch, to make sure that, now I'm driving for that neurodiverse inclusivity, because particularly in our area, in tech, it's weird. You look at stats, man. They used to think that about 6 to 8% of people in tech were neurodiverse, and now they're thinking it's more like 50 or 60. So the amount of people in my industry that don't know of the condition that they've got, I'm figuring, let me just make noise. Let me make it known. If one other person can be helped out.
Sorry, Kev, you're back, mate. Oh, sorry,
how are we sounding? Are we sounding better?
Nah, man, you're still really tinny,
man. It's a little bit better. It's a little bit better. It's a little bit better.
Can you move the mic away from you a little bit?
It's on all the same settings it normally is. I think we're dealing with Australian internet right now.
Move it away from you.
It's what I mean? It's on the other side of the desk.
Do you want to maybe put it into the other room then?
I think I'll just shut up mostly.
Yeah. All good, mate. All good. Now, we spoke about your teen years and all of that type of stuff. But what about adulthood now? Because I think for myself, especially when I went from being a teen into adulthood, you don't have people telling you, hey, don't do that or do this or whatever. You're free to do whatever the hell you want. What did that look like for you?
So there was something really interesting that happened in the shift from my teen years to adulthood, and it was very defining clearly not, I wasn't aware of what was happening. If I look back now, it's very clear, but it goes back to sort of what you were saying before. So I was a pretty good kid in school as far as like I was a clown, but I never got into trouble. So like I wasn't the shoplifting kid. I didn't smoke weed. I didn't drink underage. I didn't do any of that stuff. I didn't even smoke cigarettes. I was like super, super well behaved in terms of outside of academia. And I wasn't really social, as in like I wasn't a kid that went to a lot of parties, or I didn't really get invited to a lot of parties, but I didn't participate in the social environment. As soon as I turned 18, I remember going out, and the first time I went out was to a nightclub in Melbourne that used to be called the Chevron. And the Chevron had Thursday night, uni night, which was dollar pots and spirits. And, you know, obviously if you're a poor uni student, you go there.
Totally.
There's big crowds, a lot of lights.
With everyone else, yeah.
Great. It was my first time like in nightclubs. I'd never been to nightclubs. I'd never even snuck in underage. But all of a sudden I'm in a nightclub and I'm like what you were saying before, I can't deal with this. Is full on. Like there's so much people, so much stuff. But then you start on these and you're like, wow, life's good now. Like if I have a drink, it's sweet. Like I can talk to anyone. I can dance. I'm not even worried. So then, you know, drinking on the regular was the thing. And that was my, okay, well now I can be social. Just have a couple of drinks, all good. And then I fell into that scene, and I started DJing. I started doing all of that stuff because I just loved, you know, what I discovered, and it became a passion for me. But obviously, with those passions, in particular in those scenes, you know, recreational drug use was another thing that sort of started to creep in my mid-20s. And I say hand on my heart, the first time I ever took ecstasy, it changed my whole ability to connect and relate to other people to a point where, you know, people that do that will express how that feels for them. But I know now that was really a similar, and I won't say similar because it's not, but in knowing how to use stimulants to change the way my mind works was something that I obviously learned organically through that process. And then those stimulant types of recreational drugs become something that you use to get a result that is typically medicating yourself, but you're doing it wrong. You shouldn't be doing that. But, you know, that's where I started to understand that something's up with my brain, because I always struggled with personal relationships. I've always struggled with family relationships. I've always struggled with relationships at work.
Has that changed now, out of curiosity?
It's getting better. It's getting better because I know what my role is. And what I'm responsible for, you know, in those relationships.
And sorry, because it's actually interesting. So, you know, with work, for example, how, like, why doesn't it work type of thing, if you don't mind me asking? You know, is it that you just feel like you keep to yourself, or I'm not sure.
My biggest issue in my work life was the ability to make rational decisions based on fact without being overwhelmed by the emotional value of the decision. Which is one of the things we were talking about before, that probably the biggest change I noticed with being medicated is that now whenever I am faced with a choice, I'm no longer faced with like this tsunami of emotion that plays out like all these different fractals of what if it goes this way, I make this choice and this happens. And like, you know, it's like Inception. My mind would play out the 400 different endings and stress about them all, where now I can sort of go, okay, well, there's not too much emotion with it now. Let me make the decision based on the facts that I have in front of me and the people that are involved. So that's something that I've never been able to do. And now when I look back, you know, you just see time after time where ADHD had played its role.
Yeah, crazy. You know, but, you know, obviously, you know, I know for myself, especially in adulthood, it just spiraled out of control for a long time. And, you know, definitely with drugs. And and alcohol, all of that. But, I just got to a real point where I hated feeling the way I did when I was utilizing those types of, things, right? So, for example, let's say a Friday afternoon, you catch up with all of your mates for a beer, and then you wake up Saturday morning and you're just hungover as, right? Yeah. And I remember having a Friday night where I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to watch the cricket tonight, for example. All of my mates were sitting out the back just pissing on and all of that. I said, you know what? And they were out there and like, hey, Will, you coming out? I'm like, no, I'm just going to sit here and watch the cricket. And then I'll never forget waking up the next day and being like, oh, my God, I'm going to go and pay my bills. Because back in those days, you would have to pay your bills at the post office or whatever like that. And just the feeling of being clear-headed, it was almost like a drug within itself.
I think neurodivergent self-medicating with alcohol and drugs too can be a bit more extreme than your neurotypical person using those things. So hangovers can be worse and you go a bit harder. And
yeah, totally.
And the thing that always used to happen to me too, that it was weird because I couldn't understand the philosophy behind it. But whenever I was in those circles and under the influence, particularly of a stimulant recreational drug, I could do amounts of that stimulant, and all my friends would be like, "Dude, have you done anything? Because you seem normal. There's." And I would feel normal. I would actually sit there and be like, I can think clearly. It was such a weird experience for me. But an early indicator that there was just something not quite right with the chemistry of my brain.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely interesting how it works. But what were some positive ways that neurodivergence impacted your early years? Did you see some? And maybe going into your 20s as well, what was, and I think when Photon John and I were putting these questions together, I think a big thing for me was, I got into a band. I was very creative with writing. I would do things a lot differently to others. That was something that really was good. But then it was the whole other side of the thing, like what you were speaking about, is I was then around drugs, alcohol, that party lifestyle that sort of broke it up type of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The positive stuff, I mean, I was very content being alone. I was a loner, and I was always happy being alone. And I remember, when I started holidaying, we used to holiday in Gippsland when I was probably between the ages of maybe 10 and 18. And it was one of those places you would go to. It's a caravan park, and there's a lot of outdoor activities, and kids are riding motorbikes, and dudes are going off adventures in the bush and water skiing and all that sort of stuff. And I was pretty content taking back then it was a Sega Mega Drive. I was pretty content taking my Mega Drive up to the caravan.
Mega Drive, eh?
Old Mega Drive, and I would just sit in the caravan for 2 weeks and play. And I remember everyone saying to me,
"What'd you come on a trip for?"
Exactly. Yeah. This understanding of, you need to be doing these other things. But I used to love what I loved. And the thing that I remember as a kid was if I loved something, man, I was so in love with it. And I used to love playing video games. I used to love just watching my favorite movies as a kid over and over again, listening to the same music over and over again. I started collecting comics when I was in year 7, and then I started collecting figurines, and I became obsessed with Star Wars. And it's just like my obsession with things I actually love. I love that I'm driven to know so much about some things sometimes. I walk around with so much useless knowledge in my head, but sometimes someone can say something and I can drop comment and jump in on that conversation as if I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. I know one of
love that.
I know one of my favorite things was just to take drugs and watch Train Spotting, and I would watch that like 3 times in a row in a night. And I would do that most weekends, if I wasn't out doing stuff. And it never even occurred to me that it was a bit strange until my friends were like, "Hey, normal people don't do that, right?" Oh, okay.
Well,
it was The Matrix for me.
Yeah.
Or The Matrix was that show that I just.
Yeah.
Or sitting there like early hours of the morning, coming down, watching Rage.
Oh.
Did you ever do that? Yeah. Oh my God! I just think about that. I'm like, cringe.
Yeah, and if you couldn't get to sleep, you were up long enough to then watch Recovery, because Recovery would come on at about 8 or 9 in the morning, and that's when you knew like the whole day's a waste now.
Yeah, totally. So what was the catalyst for you getting a diagnosis? I think we actually covered this before, so we might move on from that actually.
Yeah.
Now, your diagnosis is recent, so what are your takeaways so far?
There's so many. There's so many. I think, the one thing that I'm finding hard, but is omnipresent, is this concept of now that you have your diagnosis, like, be kinder to yourself. Because I've always been my harshest critic. And again, that being built on things like rejection sensitivity and the issues that come from no real confidence or self-belief. But I'm trying to, even in times like today, I was just doing something around the house and I got it wrong. And the first thing that my mind does is start going, "You piece of shit. Like, why do you even keep doing these things when you can just never get them right?" It's like, no matter how many times you've done it, you keep making the same mistakes. And then I'm like, this is the point where I've got to get my mind to change that response. And I can only do that by reminding myself that this is how I am. Like, I'm going to continue to do this for the rest of my life. It's not going to change. So I'm trying to become a bit more content in sitting with that, be kinder to yourself. But you're undoing 44 years worth of negative self-talk. So there's work to do there. But I think that's the thing that is probably the most freeing for me, is once I can be convinced that it's all right, it's just how you are, things will get better. So that's definitely one of the key takeaways.
The other
key takeaway.
Did you arrive at that point right away, or was it a bit of a realization to get to that point? Because I know for myself, it was more, now that I know what it is, I can learn how to be a normal person. And it took me a while to realize, no, I can learn how my brain works and to accept that and to work better with that, rather than thinking that I could be fixed.
Yeah. I am still in that adjustment phase, John.
So you were just you figured out just to be yourself, right? Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So self-kindness, we hear a lot.
70% do that.
Yeah, it's sort of like interesting because, like, I think I learned this over actually the pandemic, the importance of being yourself, how much better that is on your mental health as well. And I think that's carrying into my diagnosis and all of that stuff, because especially in business, all of that, I used to wear suits, shaved head, stuff like that. And it's like, that so wasn't me. And I think back to those days and I'm like, I don't know, I just felt weird. I look at it and I think, oh my God, how strange, and I think like what you were saying before, Myke, was like, was it to just try and please people, or was I trying to live a world that I'm not? For example, I was trying to be some big business person who wears a suit, who's like a CEO or something like that. But a CEO doesn't have to wear a suit these days. You can just be you. And once I realized that, that was where, man, I just was able to thrive so much better.
I used to brush up against a lot of my old managers for that very topic. So I was the guy that always went to work like this. I've been a jeans, T-shirt and hoodie guy most of my life. And again, very ASD in nature, right? Like always comfy clothes. And I used to brush up against management who'd be like, "No, if you're going to see that client, it's got to be full suit. I'm like, why? Because that's what's expected. I'm like, why is that expected? Why is it expected that I walk in a suit? And does it matter if I walk in a suit, talk absolute rubbish, don't know anything that I need to know about, and just bullshit my way through it? Is the suit going to sell that? Or is it better that I go in with a hoodie and a pair of jeans and actually know what I'm talking about? I used to always have that grief.
I've had this experience lately with rebranding my business and calling it punk digital instead of proper digital. And it came to me when I was getting my knuckle tattoos, and it was running through my head like, oh, what are clients going to think about this? And I was like, you know what? No, I need to be more myself and more like this. And they might look at me sideways when I come in the room, but once I start talking, they can see that I know what I'm doing. And I get that freedom and that stress relief of being myself, you know?
And that's the gift. Again, that's the gift that I've been afforded with this employment. Though I have worked for other employers that were very supportive and encouraging and things like that, never have I been in a business where you were so invited to be yourself. But then I'm also aware too that, like, you know, at an executive level, there is a little bit more opportunity to be yourself, right? Because you're sort of setting the standard. So at that point, you know, that's where then I also lent right into that diagnosis, because, well, now I can actually set an example as to what it means to build an environment for people to thrive. Because I've got inside knowledge, you know, for the first time ever, I've got inside knowledge in what it's like to be of neurodivergence, simply just having lived a life that way. And I've never just naturally known something. So that's one of those things where I think, okay, well, this is really, I'm not going to say it's a calling, but it's something that I need to be able to spend more time leaning into. Otherwise, it's a waste.
And you want to anyway, because you remember your own experience being undiagnosed for so long, and you don't want to see other people have to go through that. And the only way that changes is through conversations.
Correct.
Yeah, no, and it's true, because how many, and I don't know about you guys, but I am coming across so many people now who, just because I'm talking about certain things or I'm open about certain things, they're learning a lot more about themselves, and they're going, oh my God, I think I'm this now. And they'll end up going, get tested, all that, and it'll come back that they're ADHD or they're ASD or whatever that is.
Yeah.
What about your mum?
That's her experience. So through my sister's diagnosis and my diagnosis, she got to her own.
Oh, really? There you go.
And now she's learning through the podcast and just knowing me, and yeah, it's great. Great to see.
Oh, nice. It's definitely.
I get a stack of messages now. Like, you know, I'm pretty vocal on LinkedIn. Because LinkedIn can be a bit dry, particularly in our community. You know, people don't necessarily do a lot of talking about that. So I've made a point to really be loud about it on LinkedIn, and I get people messaging me. Some of these people I've known for 10, 15 years, and all of a sudden they reach out. They're like, hey, just wanted to ask you some questions because I've got a son, you know, that is showing these sorts of things, and what should you think I should do? Or, you know, did you relate to this when you were a kid? And just little things where I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to keep doing this because it seems to be working.
It's actually that's so interesting, because whenever I'm talking at conferences or whatever, you know, I'm open as, right? And it's the parents after I get off stage who are coming up to me and they're like, oh my God, thank you so much for speaking, because that's my son. My son's growing up. We're really worried about, you know, what's next for them in regards to what education to do, in regards to higher learning, all of that type of stuff. And I think that's where it's really beneficial to speak about these things. And I think as well, by speaking, it's not forcing people to have to disclose, if that makes sense. They just might feel more comfortable to want to disclose then, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Or they run into you at, you know, an event 3 months from now, and you're just that person that they can gravitate to and go, hey, you know, you got 5 minutes? I just wanted to ask you something.
It's so interesting, because it's like when I do meet people who either ADHD, autistic, or whatever, we just seem to. It's like this. We just instant. Like it was like when you and I met up, right? Like to tell you the truth, right? Like when I met up with you, I drank coffee. Now, I hardly ever drink coffee, and I was on edge when I saw you, mate. I was like, oh, my God, how do I calm down? Because I hardly ever drink coffee. And it was only because I'd flown down really early in the morning that I was like, you know what, I think I might have a coffee. But, yeah, it just put me on edge. So I was on edge when I was with you. And but the thing, it was just like, oh, we just clicked. And I think it was good because we were speaking before we went on the podcast, and it was more sort of like, oh, let's just move it to the podcast now, and then it just flowed type of thing, And no, you go.
I was going to say I've got a story that I wanted to capitalize on that too, because you talk about in the vein of neurodivergent people clicking, and this is one of the things that when I got my diagnosis, my mind went back. And I went back to a point where I'm back at this caravan park that I used to holiday at, and I'm probably 13 or 14 years old. And like I said, every year upon year I would go there, and I wouldn't necessarily click with anyone because they were all very different. I remember one year there was a new family had come to the caravan park for the first time. There was a kid, Aaron. I'm certain his name was Aaron. He had a younger brother. Aaron and I became mates instantly. We didn't even know each other. And we became mates because we just had all the same little things that we liked to do. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to love coming here again because now I've finally got a friend. And I remember about 4 or 5 days after I met him, we were just riding push bikes around, and we were at the front of his caravan, and his parents came out. And his dad came up to me and said, oh, hey, it's really nice to meet you. We really appreciate you spending some time with Aaron because Aaron's got ADD and it's hard for him to make friends. I had no idea what ADD was. I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. Like, I don't know what the jam is. Like, he's a cool kid, and I'm hanging out with him, and we're having a good time. Like, whatever. But then,
that's
like,
a weird
later
thing
on
to say
years,
to a kid, actually.
Yeah, but later on, like, I started always going back to that moment, being like, what did he mean by ADD? And then, like, you learn all these different things. And then when I got my diagnosis, I'm like, well, of course, it makes perfect sense. It was the only kid that I could connect with.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hey, it's interesting. What was that like for you, Photon John?
I can't think back. I was just trying to think back then because I don't think I ever have to whether any of my friends were neurodivergent, but they probably were. Some of them. I hang out with the weirdest of the weird kids. Was definitely the metalhead punk kid in school, hanging out with all the other.
Hang on. Sorry, I need to sort of say this is totally unrelated, and this is just my ADHD brain. Wait, did you guys see the stuff with like Jane's addiction on stage?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
Oh my God,
Perry's like 65 years old, and he's trying to punch on with Navarro.
I know, man. He just he was pissed, man. Hey, he was.
Perry Farrell is a tripper.
Is he?
Like if you've ever watched an interview with him.
I've never watched interviews. I've seen him live, but I've never watched interviews with him.
I was going to say, if it's not proof of the simulation, at the same time that you've got Oasis reforming, you've got Jane's addiction breaking down on stage. It's like, what is happening? It's so weird.
Yeah, it was weird, but you know what? That was just a random thing that came to my mind. I think the reason why I wanted to share it was because, Photon John, you always talk about you were the weird kid or something like that, but then for some reason you'd always talk about Smashing Pumpkins, how you would always connect with people. You know what I mean? So I was like, oh, I got Jane's addiction,
Yeah. But music got me through a lot of that weirdness.
This is another thing that I'd do. If I ever was doing a PhD, it would be trying to uncover the music genres that people relate to the most as undiagnosed ADHD sufferers as children. Because I find there's so many people that I connect. We all like the same bands. We all like the same type of music, not necessarily exactly the same, but the fundamentals of what the music did was universal. And what I found was I was always into music that had very clear rhythmic or polyrhythmic elements to it with big drums, big bass, because that was where I would orient myself in music. I would put music on for days because, again, it was my other way to shut things out. So I was always attracted to music like that.
I don't know if my view is skewed because I listen to alternative music, but I found most of my neurodivergent friends were drawn to alternative style music. Not everyone, but I think that could be. I know for me, when I discovered Smashing Pumpkins, it was that Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness album where it's like 28 songs and they're all completely different from each other. And he's singing about being alone and weird and blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, oh my God, it's my person. It's my people. This is my crowd, you know.
Yeah.
It did a lot for me.
That was Tool for me. So Tool was
Tool, definitely Tool. You know, Korn, Rage Against the Machine. It was. I think for me, it was like aggression. I loved the aggression type of thing.
Yeah,
I was more into those bands, but then I went into say more more. I wouldn't say Smashing Pumpkins are melodic, but like that more grungy sort. I sort of got into grunge after the grunge era, if that makes sense. Yeah. I don't know. It was like I got straight into heavy metal, little bit of hip hop like Beastie Boys and stuff like that, and then sort of went into a more melodic type of stuff. Now I can't listen to like the heavy stuff as much anymore. It's like it's just too hard for my brain. I need that softer stuff. But there are times where I'm like, you know what? I feel like Hatebreed today. You know what I mean? And then pump that crap, you know? But all cool.
The first time I ever saw Hatebreed, Will, was by accident. I was at a Soundwave show. Yeah. And I walked they were playing like a little booth down the back or whatever. I walked into this thing and I'm like, what the hell is going on here? People were all over the joint, man, jumping from the roof and off speaker stacks. And like there was circle pits. And this is too much for me. I had to get out of there.
Do you know what? I remember going to a big day out years ago and the White Stripes were there and they were on this like little small stage, right? Then the next year they were headlining. Do you know what I mean? It was like I saw them in this little room, man.
I had the same experience with Muse. I saw them as a three-piece on a tiny side stage at like the very last Livid Festival in the year 2000. So.
Oh wow, that would have been interesting to see. That would have been. What were they like back then?
They were just a band, you know, none of the big fireworks or anything. They only had their first album out. It was awesome. It's still a great memory.
Yeah, that's awesome. But hey, you know, if anyone wants to connect with you or find out more about the stuff, you know, your podcast, all of that, where can people connect with all your awesome stuff?
Yeah, so you can connect with me on probably LinkedIn, YouTube. I don't do many of the other socials. I'm pretty non-social in social media. But if you just give Myke Ireland a search in Google, you'll find a bunch of ways to get in touch with me.
That's actually spelled MYKE, correct?
MYKE, correct. Yeah, MYKE Ireland. So LinkedIn is Myke Ireland, YouTube is Myke Ireland. But yeah, you can find a bunch of ways to get in touch with me.
Yeah, cool. Myke, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been so awesome
My pleasure, man.
You know, listen to your story, being able to relate to a lot of things about your story as well. I think I was tripped off how we finished off with music there. Never really done something like that before.
Probably do another hour just about that one day, Will.
Yeah. Totally. But no, it's good. But you know what? That's what I love about podcasts. You can just do whatever you want. And that's a podcast, you know. You don't have to be formal, like all of that type of stuff. It's just a chat, you know. But no, look, thank you so much for coming on, and we really appreciate it, my man.
Yeah, I love being part of it. Thanks so much for reaching out. Again, we broke the world record today for the first ever guest.
There we go, man. I'm glad to be a part of that. But look, for all of our listeners out there, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, like, and follow all of our social media platforms and check us out on any podcasting platform. My name's Will Wheeler, joined with my main man, Fodon John, and this is Neurodivergent Mates. Till next time.